All right, welcome everyone to the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. It's Wednesday, February 10th. We're taking up two items today. The first is revisions to the Bethesda Urban Partnerships bylaws, and then we're taking up a zoning text amendment for wireless infrastructure. Let's begin with our first item. Carlos.
All right. Good afternoon, council members. So, like Councilmember Reamer said, today we'll be discussing the proposed revisions to the Bethesda Urban Partnership, or BUP, bylaws, with the hopes that you all will make a recommendation to the full council regarding approval of the bylaws. So the current version of the bylaws were approved by the council in 2006. Section 68A-10 of the county code specifies that any later amendments to the bylaws must be submitted to the county council and the county executive for approval at least 60 days before the board of directors takes final action on the amendments. All the bylaws must be filed with the county executive within 5 working days of adoption. So that kind of sets the scene a little bit. So in August, BUP submitted to former council president Katz proposed revision to the bylaws. Thereafter, BUP staff, council staff, executive staff, and staff from the county attorney's office had several meetings and conversations regarding the bylaws to ensure that the changes conform to the code and more generally just made sense. So the code outlines provisions governing urban district corporations, their board of directors, their employees, their powers, their budgets, and so forth. So in the packet that you all have, I attempt to outline the material changes that were proposed by BUP that are either governed by the county code or that make changes to BUP's procedures or processes. So if you all would like, I can go through it point by point, and I can stop to allow you guys, if you have any questions or comments, you can make them, and then we can proceed that way, or if you have another idea in mind.
I tell you what, I don't want to not imply that this isn't really important, but if are there any particular concerns? Maybe we could turn it to our BUP leadership. Are there any particular things that we need to be sure to focus on? I'm not sure, and maybe Andrew will know better, but I'm not sure that we have to go through this extensively in detail just because we have new bylaws. So if there are particular points of interest or concern, I'd like to know, and we could maybe focus on those.
Yeah, that's a good approach. I don't believe there's anything in here that's controversial.
Okay, great, thank you.
I think we can just get confirmation from the county attorney that nothing in here is of concern and that everybody is recommending that we approve it. It's been shared. This is part of the public process. This is how the urban district works. We're required to do this, but it's a fairly pro forma exercise. I don't believe there's anything in here that's remotely controversial. There's nothing of particular new interest, I don't believe, and this is just part of the standard process. I will just say that BUP has been a terrific partner, historically, but particularly during the pandemic. And I just want to offer my personal appreciation as the council member who represents Bethesda, but also as a resident, because we just saw with the recent snowstorms, but all of the streetery issues and all of the different dynamics with our local businesses and residents trying to adapt to this new normal that isn't normal at all, and BUP's ability to adapt to that has been extraordinary. It's a credit to the hardworking staff and the leadership that's joined us. I just want to offer my appreciation, but this item itself is non-controversial, and I would move that we approve it without objection.
Great, agreed. I think everyone's got BUP envy. Jeff, would you like to just share some comments here?
Sure. Thank you. Appreciate those kind words from both of you. We appreciate your support, and we're always here to help. Don't be envious. Just use us as a resource. I don't think there's anything controversial. I would like to thank Neil and Carlos for helping us work through this and make sure that there's nothing controversial. It was just really an update to make sure that they were all up to code. They were, we were meeting all of the new Maryland Open Meetings Act procedures and policies. So we appreciate the work and look forward to continuing.
Super. Neil, anything you'd like to add?
No, just confirming that there is nothing controversial in these bylaws. Just an update. So,
well, we've got items on the agenda today that are quite controversial, so we'll save our powder for those. And I think we have approval. So
great.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you. Appreciate your work. It's important to be diligent about these issues because you never know when there's something that requires some ironing out. So really appreciate that. It's an important part of the process.
Absolutely.
If you don't mind, I'm going to cut out now. Then I have nothing to do with the second.
Oh yeah.
Agenda
Well,
item.
no, actually, we want you to stay and give us a recommendation on 5G. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody.
I don't think Mr. Juando is here. Is he
Thank you.
here? All right. So we are approved on that item.
Yeah, I think he has some personal obligation.
I know he does. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Well, we're done with this item, so we can go to the next. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you all. Have a good one.
You too. So we'll move on to consideration of, sorry, pull up the packet here. Zoning text amendment 1907. And let's see who we have joining us today. All right, good. Anyone else? Okay. Good. Well, where to begin? We are returning to an item that has long been before the council and has long been unresolved. And we have some staff changes first to just note after many decades of superb and often humorous council policy and legal work. Jeffrey Zients has changed his role. He's now a fellow at the council and no longer an employee at the council. And we are welcoming Livu. Sorry, Livu, it's not in Jew, it's Naju, right?
Yeah, sorry, it's pronounced Livu Nadu.
Livu Naju. And Livu is our new top zoning attorney, and we're really excited about her work. And fortunately, she comes from Baltimore City, where they have already been working through many of the issues around the expansion of wireless antennas on city infrastructure and other infrastructure. And so Pam Dunn is joining Livu, and we'll be tag teaming on this as we work our way through. And we have a number of executive branch staff who are with us, and also our hearing examiner. I just I'll try to keep my comments brief here, but we really need to resolve this. And I think that COVID-19 is showing how wireless networks are more important than ever. The share of the workforce that is teleworking, the number of students who are distance learning, the number of patients who are getting consultations through telemedicine are all just really important examples of how wireless is integral infrastructure for any community, and it is no different than roads or sewers and water pipes and electricity grids. It's part of the essential communications and infrastructure of a community. And we have a problem, which is that our existing networks are running out of capacity. We all have so many devices. If I were to think about my own house, the number of devices in my house is something I never would have imagined would be normal 3, 4, 5 years ago. And yet now here we are. I probably have 25 devices connected to my home Wi-Fi right now. And, we actually leave the house, believe it or not, and we use the wireless networks that are outside the house. And, we're lucky in this county to have fiber optic service that is available. We even have more than one company that provides fiber optic to the home. But there are a lot of communities that don't have that, just for starters. And there are a lot of communities that have less than adequate wireless coverage as well. We don't want to be one of those communities. So first, on the first hand, I'd say that our ability to get broadband is really a function of the marketplace and the competitiveness of the marketplace. And it is an oligopolistic marketplace. And 5G is going to disrupt that. There will be more companies providing wireless speed networks. And there's going to be more companies for customers to choose from. And so if you don't like Verizon and you think that, Comcast, just makes your life, if you want to get revenge, like what you want to do is bring more companies into this market space and help more companies compete. And you'll get better service. And one way to do that is for this county to legalize the placement of antennas where the future is gigabit speed, broadband speed wireless. And, ultimately we're all going to live in a community where, hopefully, where you are constantly, your devices are constantly connecting through different networks. And you ideally wouldn't even know which one you're connecting through. You might be on your Wi-Fi at home over fiber, and then you move to a part of the house where your Wi-Fi signal isn't as strong and it shifts to the 5G reception coming from utility pole out on the street. And then you walk out of your house and you're connecting over 4G or 5G. You get into your car, you drive, your car is connecting through 5G, and that's the way we'll live our lives. And that's the future. So do we want to have that here? I think is the core question, or do we want to continue to prohibit the infrastructure placement of antennas? And so since we last met, there was a legal challenge that the county was party to, and it went through the Court of Appeals. I was certainly comfortable moving forward despite that challenge being ongoing, but my colleagues asked that we give that challenge a chance to work its way through, and I accepted that. So we waited for that. And now we are back because that challenge went, I think, as probably predicted. And it largely upheld the FCC's decisions, which have a big effect on our discretionary powers. So we're gonna talk through all that stuff today. We're gonna work through the packet. We're not voting on anything today. Just to be clear, we're just gonna work our way through the various issues and talk about some of the more important points and find out issues for follow-up. We'll begin. I certainly defer to Councilmember Friedson if he wants to make any opening comments, but to me, this is about whether we want these to continue to work. Do we want these to continue to have the power that they have? We all get so much out of our devices now. There is so much benefit in wireless for the way we live our lives, the work that we do, every aspect of our lives. And the last thing I should think we would want to be is on the wrong side of the digital divide. And I think it would be most unfortunate if we put ourselves there deliberately. So I'd very much like to avoid that. Okay, so Andrew, if you'd like to make any opening comments.
Yeah, I just briefly, I appreciate the fact that we're returning to this, that we're going to dive into the details. I think, this is all complicated, and just really understanding what our role is, what the limitations are that we have, what we're able to decide on, and what we can't. And also, I think having a real in-depth understanding of parity, both parity within the county and what is allowed and where, what is appropriate and where, and parity with regional and national counterparts. I think to me that those are appropriate areas and things that we really ought to focus on. And appreciate the fact that we're getting back to this, and it's an important topic. There's a lot of interest in it for understandable reasons, and I think we have our work cut out for us, and appreciate that we're going to methodically go through and deal with each of these substantive issues one by one, and then see where we end up. So thank you.
Okay, so Livu, Pam.
I'm just going to turn it over to Livu. She's been leading this one because she's had some experience with this in her job in Baltimore County. So she's taken the lead on this and written the.
Sorry, is it county, not city? I apologize.
Sorry.
City, sorry.
I might be wrong.
It was city. Yes. Okay. Baltimore City.
So I'm going to step aside. Livu will handle it, but I'm here to help also answer questions, process questions, code questions, whatever comes up.
Okay.
But I'm going to let her take it away.
All right. Well, Livu, we start off with probably one of the more challenging ones. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Very excited to be here in the middle of such a very easy ZTA. So as a quick overview, so the first, so the ZTA does a few things. So first, it's allowing poles as a limited use in residential zones, where it's replacing an existing pole, and that's utility poles or street light poles, as well as the parking lot light poles. And then the bigger part, which will probably be most of the discussion today, is amending the conditional use standards for the poles in residential zones. And that's for under, I believe, 30 feet, and for ones that don't meet those limited use standards. And we're going to do it in a few ways. First is batching those conditional use applications, because one big issue here is the shot clock, which is an FCC rule. And so the ZTA sort of addresses different ways to shorten that shot clock time period, because under Montgomery County's current conditional use standards, it's basically impossible to meet that shot clock. So some of the proposals are to take out planning's reports and recommendations, so to skip that part. And also that those conditional use applications are only going to go to the hearing examiner to basically decide where within a certain location would be the best place for that pole. Because one of the things in the FCC is we can't just say, no, you can't have one at all. So instead it's letting the hearing examiner decide, not that there can't be any, but where exactly it should be. Another idea was to eliminate the need to go to the Board of Appeals. So if you go to the hearing examiner, then you could go straight to circuit court from there. That would also shorten the shot clock. And then one of the newer ideas we've had is to use a waiver and objection process instead, which would mean not going through the conditional use process and instead doing a waiver and objection that's similar to people who know to the process that's used for accessory dwelling units. So that way, not every single application would have to go to the hearing examiner, only ones where there's a specific objection from the community or a specific request for a waiver from the applicant.
Okay, so as you alluded to, and as Andrew said, since we last met, there has been a resolution of the court case in the Ninth Circuit. And
Yes.
so we now have pretty firm, parameters to work around. We did not really have that. We had what we thought was likely to be, standards from the FCC, but I think there's a little bit more clarity about that now. So one of the tasks that we'll have, as you said, is assessing what processes we have and how they would match against the federal requirements. So we'll, try to bring that out today. All right, so can we just work through the packet one item at a time, and we'll turn to the executive branch, at various points in that discussion.
So I think, so working through the packet in order, I think the first thing in there is the limited use, which is on page 4 for people who are looking at the packet. I'm not sure. The limited use thing, I don't know if there's as much controversy about, but if there's questions about that, I can certainly answer them or work through them that way.
All right, well, so, basic here question is, should they be allowed as a limited use? Limited use is a way of explaining that there isn't a lot of additional approval processes. So they can be put on a pre-existing utility pole or a street light, or another approved pole. So that's one of the core questions of the zoning text amendment. I suppose we should probably just continue more into the details. As Andrew observed, it's kind of more about the details than anything. So let's proceed to number 2.
So number 2 is if they're allowed as a limited use, under what standards should they be allowed? This is basically the setbacks, the height, and the design standards. So the setback is with a 60-foot setback. We've actually reduced it to 30 feet. So that's where it would trigger that conditional use approval. And then for the height, for streetlights, the height of the pole that's being replaced, you're going to get +6 feet if you abut a right-of-way with a paved section width of 65 feet or less, and then +15 feet when you abut a right-of-way with a paved section width greater than 65 feet. And then for those parking lot lights, the height of the pre-existing parking light pole +10 feet. So those are the height requirements for limited use. And then the design standards include the footer and the replacement street light have to be approved by the Department of Transportation. And then the antenna has to be in an enclosure that's the same color as the pole, and it has to be installed parallel. And then the tower itself must be the same color as the pre-existing pole, and then it can't have any visible exterior wiring around it.
All right. So in the packet, you've provided some information about some of our, regional jurisdictions and other decisions that they've made, which I think are really important for us to grapple with. We have Arlington County basically says a company can install an antenna wherever a utility pole or street light exists. That is the clearest way to get what the community wants, which is high quality networks. Sorry, I just see I'm joined by Craig Rice, and I'm glad he's here. I should have mentioned, I didn't, I apologize. Councilmember Rice, Councilmember Albornoz, and myself are the 3 sponsors of the zoning text amendment. And there he is. And I would actually welcome your making some comments. You've been chairing the broadband task force for NACO, the National Association of Counties. And, I know that's brought additional perspective. That's a role you took on, since you signed up as a strong supporter on this. So welcome your thoughts here. And then I see Debbie has raised her hand as well.
Well, Mr. Chair, let me just say first, thank you for your leadership in this role. This is incredibly important to us as we look to a broadband initiative in terms of having high quality access for everyone, not just here in this region, but across the United States. And what I've heard from some of my colleagues with the National Association of Counties is that this plays an integral role in terms of making sure that for some of those areas where fiber may not be the ultimate solution and may not be the solution that is viable for the immediacy, we still need to get people connected. We see from the urgency in which an economic recovery standpoint, education recovery standpoint, health recovery standpoint, everyone is relying upon access to technology. I will just share a moment of personal pride as my mother just got notification that she was eligible for a vaccine and flew out of here. So I'm very happy about that. She's 81, has diabetes. And so certainly for her, pre-existing conditions, as well as everything, and as well as her age, puts her more at risk. And so certainly being able to access that. However, I will tell you that it required a lot of reliance upon technology. And in fact, in answering all of the questions that you needed to answer and fill out the form to be eligible, required her coming in and interrupting my Zoom to be able to help her to get it done so that she could lock in her appointment. That being said, again, these are the things that are oftentimes denied to many folks. The child who sits in the parking lot of their parent's job because they don't have access to broadband at home makes a tremendous difference in terms of them being able to access their Zoom classes. The reason why I leave my home and go to the office on Tuesdays is because both my daughter and I trying to do Zoom at the same time is not possible based on the speeds that we need to have, both of us as high users. And so from that perspective, look, there is no question that we need to do more. We needed to do more before, but certainly now with the world continuing to change the way it has and the reliance upon technology, all of our smart devices that continue to pull down information via the web, all of our devices, personal devices that we use each and every day, there's no question that we have to have this technology and it has to be accessible. This is a key contingent as a part of what NACO will release as its priorities when it comes to broadband access for all. And so from that perspective, we're lockstep in what I see as the wave of the future, but quite honestly, the wave of the present. And so from that perspective, I'm very happy to support this and think that we are headed in the right direction in terms of promoting connectivity for all of our residents. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I want to thank you for your strong leadership on technology at MCPS. We shouldn't gloss over the fact that there are 10,000 students in MCPS with MiFi devices that have been provided by MCPS because they don't have broadband at home. So what are they getting? They're getting a wireless device. It connects to the wireless networks. And there are also 1,500 teachers who are getting these devices to connect to wireless networks. That's a good indication of where we're going, but also, as you said, where we are. And, we're going to see as we get into the maps of what the implications of different approaches would be. But I really appreciate you starting off with the urgency about people trying to get vaccinated. Why should people who live in Tacoma Park have less ability to get vaccinated because they live in a community where their homes are a little bit closer to the utility poles, and therefore their utility poles wouldn't be eligible for antennas? Why should people be at a disadvantage relative to other communities that were built more recently with further setbacks where they don't have that issue? Why should one person on one block be able to get access to technology and another person on another block can't? That is where we are heading. That is the path that we literally are on right now, because we don't allow for the continued deployment of antennas. And so it's more and more of an access inequity. And it's a different kind of inequity, but it's one that is really powerful and has big consequences. So thanks for grounding us there in our present.
You know me,
yeah.
I don't like to get caught up too much in the technical aspects. I certainly can. I've learned so much when it comes to, and I really want to thank folks like Mitzi and others who have continued to help support me in that effort. But to just tell you that at the end of the day, the real stories, the real instances of what our community continues to struggle with are really the things that should take the lead and folks should remember. This is one in which you talk about when it comes to racial equity and social justice, we are paying very close attention. It's a part of the broadband task force. In fact, one of the subcommittees that we've developed under the broadband task force is solely around this effort. It is a part of our conversations with giants like Congressman Clyburn, who continues to work on this effort to where the focus is racial equity and social justice. It is tied to the access to this technology. And by denying that to not only just race, right? But denying it to older individuals, denying it to others, you are leaving them behind, you are marginalizing them and not allowing them to participate in this technology economy that we find ourselves in. I mean, even from the standpoint of just, selling your wares. If you're a grandmother who is making ends meet by selling socks that she, makes in her home and having access to that technology to be able to set up e-commerce, which is real. I mean, these are real stories that happen right here in Montgomery County. And to make sure that we have those folks connected and so that they're not set at a disadvantage is incredibly important. And so those are the stories that I will continue to tell, not only from what we see happening in our community, but in our nation as the impetus for why we need to make sure that this technology is deployed to as many people as feasibly possible.
Well said. Thank you. Debbie, did you want to comment?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for giving me a moment. Thank you for holding this. I just wanted to take a moment and explain kind of a perspective from the executive branch a little bit, not so much in the details of the first part of the ZTA. I wanted to first say, I've just been asked to kind of oversee or coordinate the team within the executive branch about there are a number of different parts to the cell tower siting and different issues. And I wanted to give you all a little bit of the update on some of what's going on also. As you guys know, the 1802 ZTA covered all the commercial areas, which is where there's really intense demand and where the 5G becomes potentially especially important. And there are two parts that, administrative parts that we're working on to make sure that access there is doable. And one is the franchise agreements and the other, or certain franchise agreements, and the other is license agreements for use on our pools. And we are well on our way to finishing franchise agreements and are in conversations back and forth with some of the telecom companies. And on license agreements, we're in the midst of drafting and also doing a cost study to understand the actual cost for the right-of-way so that we have an appropriate license agreement, which also has implications potentially in residential areas. One of the big issues around all of this is the Tower Committee, or the TFCG, known as the Tower Committee. And there's been a, certainly when folks testified on the CTA and at other points, there's been a lot of concern about the process. And so we've really tried to start to look at what does the Tower Committee do? How well does it do it? Where's the appropriate role for resident input? How do we make sure that it's improving as needed? We had started those conversations and then the pandemic hit, and it has taken us a little while to get back up and running and focusing on things other than that. But we've had some very constructive meetings, and I think, we're coming to a place where we think there's a better way to get resident input at the right time so that the timing works and there's an opportunity to fix it. We'll be coming back to you with some proposed changes. We're also looking at the possibility of post-installation inspections, which has been a big issue. And it's our understanding we have the authority to do that. And it makes a lot of sense because there's been a number of issues around that. And additionally, we're looking at fees to reflect the cost of this because the fees have not changed in 18 years at the Tower Committee. Just want to give a quick comment about the courts. It's true, the Ninth Circuit came up with a decision, but I just, and as the staff packet notes, there was some good news about the aesthetic requirements, and it's really important going forward in terms of how we think about how the ZTA is structured and what the aesthetic requirements are. Just wanted to mention, and I don't know if you were going to, about the other lawsuit in circuit court regarding I believe shot clock as well as equipment cabinets, which is a huge issue. It could have impact on this, and it's regarding an FCC declaratory ruling. There's another lawsuit on the RF standards, and whether, as y'all may remember, we were involved in a lawsuit previously on this issue. It was deemed moot at the Ninth Circuit. Another group went back and challenged the FCC ruling. That is now back in court. We're not a party to that, but it raises some interesting issues in terms of if it is determined that the standards need to be updated, what the implications may be for that. So just wanted to highlight those. Also wanted to mention on the digital divide, as you know, one of the biggest obstacles is cost, and increased competition is certainly an indirect approach, but at some point, and maybe not today, but certainly Mitzi and others can talk about some of the work that the team's been doing on really kind of direct additions to addressing the digital divide, because for many of our low-income community, it's not there, it's just that they can't afford it. And then lastly, just to go back to the ZTA in residential areas, we agree there's some issues that need to be addressed. We really want to address it. I think it's important to make sure that the process, especially for the Tower Committee, where so many of these applications would be coming through, that process is fixed. And we also think there needs to be kind of clearer resident input. I know there's been a lot of, I know some of this was reflected in the packet about some of the concerns about the ZTA as currently drafted, and certainly we have some concern about the changed conditional use process, and it's an interesting idea about maybe there's an alternative process rather than the conditional use, and maybe that's something different. So just want to kind of give those general comments, and I'll.
Debbie, thank you. ZTA 1802 was passed almost 3 years ago. What's taking so long to finalize the regulations?
So I think on the franchise agreement and on the license agreement, so there have been some franchise agreements that have already been approved since then. It's frankly, some of the newer ones are in conversations back and forth about wanting to change some of the standards, and given 1802. So the license agreement, I have not been involved in that until, yes, it was passed in 2018. There's been a change of administration, and then there's been some trying to understand where the obstacles were. We're trying to move on it very quickly, and are working with some outside counsel as well for help to move it faster. County executive is frustrated as well, so we're trying to move it. And I think we can soon. We've got the right-of-way cost study. It's well underway. That should finish fairly soon. I'm not sure if Mitzi knows the finish date. And
well, we'll move on. I find it completely unsatisfactory that you haven't resolved those issues. You said that we should be happy that the infrastructure is allowed in these very small parts of the county, the urban centers. However, you haven't finalized the rules that are needed even really to deploy there. So that's cold comfort. But in any event, I sort of think it's irrelevant, because the reality is that what we want is companies to come in and build networks across the whole county, and we want every community to be covered. And we don't want any neighborhood to be left behind. And we don't want to create a digital divide where Aspen Hill has no 5G and, wherever, Rockville has it. And unfortunately, that's literally the path that we're, it's not even going to happen in Rockville yet, but that's where we're going. And we got to change that dynamic. So let's get back to the packet. And we were just observing the standards in the region. So Arlington County basically says wherever there, I don't know if Andrew, you want to speak. Sorry if I missed it. I'm looking at my.
No, that's all right. I didn't realize that this was going to come up, but I have heard concerns about the speed at which the process of what has already been approved. It's tough that we're taking on new issues when we haven't been able to figure out the existing issue. And so I was just wondering, pandemic has changed things, the change of administration, I get that, but any idea, since I think the people who are interested in it on all sides are probably watching this, of what soon means, what is that, realistic timeline at this point, putting aside all the things that have happened to get us to where we are without rehashing and fighting over that. Where are we today? What would the expectation be realistically? When will this be resolved? Like let's hit the reset button today and just set some realistic expectations to the public and the stakeholders of what they should be expecting from now moving forward.
So to clarify, the franchise agreements are very close. My understanding, they're back with the companies for their final comments. They're out of our hands. And the license agreement, which is only for if they want to use our street poles and our street lights. I mean, they currently have the authority to attach to buildings in all the commercial areas, which is, again, where the use is most intense, perhaps not in this moment of pandemic, but certainly generally. The license agreement, I'm going to ask Mitzi if she has a sense of that. Franchise agreement, my understanding is, I think in the next few weeks, we are sending something over to you. That's my understanding.
Okay. I mean, we've been hearing that for a long time. Again, I want to say, I don't think it matters that much. The fact that we allowed it in like 1/100th of Montgomery County is not particularly important because, the companies aren't going to make a big investment in Montgomery County if they can't serve people at home. That's where we use our wireless devices. We use them at home. And going forward, we're going to be teleworking even more. It may be a permanent fixture of life in Montgomery County and everywhere else, that you're spending several days teleworking if you have a job where you can do that. So, the idea that we would allow for more powerful networks only, in 5 blocks of downtown Silver Spring, and then leave out all the surrounding neighborhoods and it's just,
I appreciate the point of view. I just, before we move on, since we're now on the topic, it sounds, there's 2 items here, the franchise agreement and the license agreement. It sounds like the franchise agreement within a few weeks. So we'll say, by the beginning of March, you expect that something is going to be transmitted. Is that accurate? Okay. I believe in setting clear expectations so everybody knows what words and statements mean. Okay. So we'll settle on that. I think Mitzi was going to weigh in before we move on, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chair, on the license agreement, which is the other aspect of this, and what the timeline is there. Did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think that we can expect an internal draft to be circulated within a couple weeks. And then we would hope a couple weeks after that we would send it off for comment to the potential vendors.
Okay, great. So by the beginning of March, we should expect the franchise agreement to be transmitted. And by the middle of March, which would be a month from now, we should expect that that's going to be circulated for the license agreements to the impacted parties. Is that reasonable?
Yeah. Internally, in a couple weeks, within mid-March, should be off to the wireless companies to get their back and forth on it. It would be limited because the idea is that you have a master lease that everybody essentially has the same type of agreement.
Makes sense. Okay, I appreciate it. Now I know what soon means, and we can all hold each other accountable to what soon means. I appreciate the direct responses. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
all right. So good. Maybe we'll get resolution on at least those particular urban locations. So let's go back to the packet. We're in section 2A, and we're looking at the setback requirements, and we're looking at comparable jurisdictions. So Arlington County just says wherever there's a utility pole or a street light, it is allowed, for the placement of an antenna. Obviously, those are still governed by other agreements. It's not, you can do whatever you want. There are design standards and so forth. But that is the cleanest and clearest way to get what the community wants, which is great networks, to make sure that your devices work. Fairfax County has a little bit of a different approach. It is, you cannot be closer than 10 feet to a right-of-way line. So you can use any utility pole or light pole you want, but you can't place an antenna closer than 10 feet from a right-of-way line. DC, a little bit different, can't be closer than 10 feet from a building. So that is closer than Fairfax County, but not as, it's more restricted than Fairfax County, but more liberal than Fairfax County, but not as much as Arlington. Prince George's County, 300 feet from a house, 150 feet from a school. So those are some examples. We presently have, I guess it would be 300 feet is the current rule, right? In a residential area. There's not a lot of places where you can find a pole that is 300 feet from the nearest house. And so that's a prohibition, and that's why we don't get the networks. That's why they're not getting built. So when people see all the commercials on TV, I remember the World Series, it was like every other commercial was T-Mobile advertising their 5G network, recognizing that there are differences to what 5G means, and that's a whole different conversation. You're not going to get 5G in Montgomery County until we allow it to be put on the antennas to be put on the network, on the telephone poles. So let's review what's in the ZTA, Libu, please, what is proposed, and then I'd like to just kind of walk through some maps and see how this works out at the kind of neighborhood level.
So the ZTA allows a 60-foot setback, and then that would be reduced to 30 feet with the conditional use approval. That
So
would go
60 feet or farther, then it's just a permit.
Mhm.
There are design standards, there are other things that come with permits, but 60 feet or farther, you just apply for the permit. Between 30 and 60 feet, the ZTA calls for a conditional use approval, and that is sort of a modified conditional use approval. Particularly, there is a restriction in there that says the point of dispute for the community can be to find the least obtrusive location. So in other words, you're not arguing as to whether there's going to be antennas coming onto the block. You're arguing as to whether this pole is the best pole. Maybe you think it'd be better down the street. That's a reasonable dispute. But you're not trying to block 5G or densification of 4G. You're simply trying to have an influence over how it is done. That is how it was designed. I think it has to be rethought in light of the court cases. But let's go over the maps now. I wanted to just get a chance to see how this plays out. So I need to, there we go. Tommy is going to share his screen for me, and we're just going to take a quick look at how this plays out at the neighborhood level. So this is Montgomery County. And first, this might be, okay, this is the color points are dots that are poles that are farther than 300 feet from a house. So presently, under existing law, you can see Montgomery County is obviously quite large, and the only places where there are poles that are, legal are orange dots. So you're clearly not going to cover much of the county. Let's remember that 5G waves don't travel very far. They're weak waves. And so, you need proximity. So that's the present law. Next, we have 60 feet, I believe. And so this seems to do a better job. It gets to more of the county. And then let's add in 30 feet. And clearly this is, more dense, like there's a lot more dots. So this seems to be better, but now we have to zoom in and look further. So can you maybe make that screen a little bigger? Montgomery Knolls and Franklin Knolls, this is a case study. So even as written in the ZTA, the only places where it's just allowed without conditional use this is Montgomery Knolls and Franklin Knolls, are the blue dots. So basically, there's no allowance for limited use in the neighborhood. There's one pole, I guess, in the neighborhood. Whereas those are the existing structures that could be used. So, that's a problem. You've got all these structures, they're not eligible to be used. Let's go to the next neighborhood. North Potomac. Again, a lot of neighborhoods, a lot of places where, you can catch a cul-de-sac, but then across the way, you've got an entire, road where none of the houses are close enough. So you'd have a situation where you got to go down the street if you want to get access to the faster network. All right, that's, but there's no shortage of structures. They're just not eligible to be used. Let's go to Tacoma Park. All right, so here's Tacoma Park. Vast stretches of the city can't, there are no places closer than 60 feet. So everything would be conditional use. And that's just, very problematic. There are poles that can be used, but much of them would be conditional use. So, okay, keep going. Greenwood Knolls, Wheaton. Again, vast areas of neighborhoods. There's no coverage. There's going to be no densified 4G or 5G in the neighborhood. But there are plenty of structures that could be used if they were eligible. Bethesda, Kenwood Park, same thing. All right, so what we're seeing is that you have to zoom in, and when you do, it's clear that there are neighborhoods all over the county that would be on the wrong side of a digital divide if there weren't antennas on the structures near the house. And so you can be in one neighborhood and theoretically you might be able to get access. You go to another neighborhood and you wouldn't. I think there's a bigger question as to whether there would really be much deployment without broader coverage eligibility in the first place. I think that companies want to be able to have a full deployment in order to offer the real service that is capable, or else they're building inadequate service. And that's bad for a lot of things. So, if we want to get the companies to build these things and to be able to collect the revenue from the fees and all that kind of stuff too, I think you have to broadly allow it. So why don't we pause here and we can just talk about the setbacks issue, see if there's any questions here, any comments. Okay. All right. Okay, well then let's keep going. See no questions or comments.
Well, I mean,
Hey, Mr. Chair.
so,
yeah,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Craig.
Councilmember Rice can go first.
No. I will defer to the committee member, please.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say, I mean, I think it's, helpful for everybody to see the maps, but at least from my perspective, I really think focusing on what's the legal framework that we are in now, based on, where we currently are, where can we regulate, where can we not regulate, where, what is the point at which we put ourselves at, in a challenge, what is the box within which we have to operate, number one. Number two, what are others around us doing, and how far out of line with that are we? And then, addressing these issues in that context, I think personally, would be helpful. I mean, it's hard for me to ask a question based on looking at the maps. It would be easier, to ask the question if we're talking about, here is the regulatory framework within which we have to operate, whether we like it or not. That's where we currently are. That's the, I think that would, at least for me, would help to kind of target questions that I might have on setbacks, and because there are some differences with regional counterparts of how different places are regulating this, and I think it would be helpful to understand those nuances and how that is being addressed within this ZTA, and what proposals are before us potentially for changes within the ZTA, which I think we are here to discuss as well.
Yep, absolutely. I think it's necessary to just kind of set the table from a policy perspective as to why it's important to do this and what the consequences are if we don't. I think certainly it's important for us to understand the legal parameters as well. And that's going to have a big influence on what we do. And personally, I think it leads you to conclude that the closest we can get to Arlington, the best. So, we'll get into that here in a bit, but all right.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Craig, please.
Yes, so just very briefly, along those lines of the maps that you showed, it would be incredibly helpful in the spirit of our racial equity and social justice lens to understand the makeup of those neighborhoods that would be denied versus the neighborhoods that would have access. And I'm not prescribing as to what that will tell. I don't know what it will tell, but I think it will be incredibly helpful in terms of our overall evaluation of where it is that you as a committee, as well as we as a council, go in terms of where our priorities should be in providing access along, again, that lens of racial equity and social justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. And I just wanted to note for my colleagues, I did ask if we could do a racial equity analysis of the zoning change. However, OLO has been clear on multiple occasions that they can't. This ZTA was introduced prior to the the passage of the racial equity ZTA requirement, and they're just not able to do it. But I do think we can do an approximation, and I think we can answer that question all the same. It just may not be. I wish we could have a formal analysis done, and we requested that, but it just wasn't possible.
No, and I understand that, but in its stead, I think that certainly something like that would give us a lot of information to go off of. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I'm sorry, I can't figure out where, I thought there was a raise your hand button on this. But what I want to say is that we are looking at it and trying to do some analysis, looking at it through a digital equity lens. We are looking at where the census data has determined that there are households without broadband, and we're looking at the the distribution of that by race and income. We are also, we had planned to look at where we have antennas deployed now and looking at the racial characteristics of those areas, but we could add, and I will figure out a way for us to look at some of these neighborhoods, and we'll try to figure out in looking at some of these different setbacks to do that racial analysis. So that it might take us a little bit longer, but we have some data maps that we can leverage, and we'll try to get you something along those lines.
Fine. The only comment I want to make here, I think it's important that we look at this as a public good, and that we understand this is a public good that's provided by the private sector, and access to the public good is what we want. And so we're looking at it through a racial equity lens to determine how any given approach, helps or hinders access to a public good. There has been at least one effort I've seen that looks at it the opposite way and says antennas are bad, and we ought to try to limit them because they are often on apartment buildings. Since they can't be placed on light poles, they are often on apartment buildings, and that could be bad because of a difference in who lives in apartment buildings versus single family homes. And so that if you look at it from 180 degrees the wrong direction, it leads you to say we ought to be removing antennas rather than trying to add them, because you don't believe that wireless is a public good, you believe it is bad, and so you are upset about the placement of antennas. So I think it's important for us as a body to understand what it is that we want to achieve, which is access, and that we don't think access to wireless is inherently bad. And then that can help inform, how you look at the access issue. But yeah, just to the point, Councilmember Rice, I have seen this go astray with, white homeowners expressing outrage on behalf of the Black residents or the Black and brown residents of a community that there are wireless antennas on their buildings. While inside, I would imagine there's going to be more of those MiFi devices because not everybody can afford a fiber connection. So we will look at that. I think that analysis is really important, Craig, and I think we might need to see if we can get planning in to help with that a bit because they have some of the data capability, and we'll see how that goes. Andrew.
Yeah, I see the same issue, but maybe perhaps in a slightly different light. When I was talking about parity earlier, this is part of the conversation for parity. I mean, you're looking at it from a coverage and digital divide standpoint, which is an important perspective. I'm not disputing that, and certainly that's what Councilmember Rice has spent a lot of time focused on, regionally, statewide, and nationally, which I totally support. My view as well is the standards that we have within different communities within the county. To me, it's less of a question of deployment, although that's part of this conversation, but whether or not we should have dramatically different standards for places that are largely residential with apartment buildings in an urbanized county versus places of the county that are largely single family homes. That to me is an area of parity that we ought to be mindful of and sensitive towards. And again, to me, I'm thinking about it less from a coverage standpoint. At least I, up to this point, thought of it less as a coverage standpoint and more as a, should we have dramatically different standards based on the type of housing a family or an individual lives in the county? And I'm a little bit uncomfortable if that's the direction that we ultimately go in. So I think, to me, I think that is something as well, not just the coverage standpoint that we ought to think about. I also think that that is an area that we can control from a public policy standpoint a lot easier than the ultimate coverage, which is out of our control to a certain degree. So I just wanted to kind of a slightly different take on the same equity issue that you and Councilmember Rice were raising.
Right. I mean, I think if I understand what you're saying, it's like if you live in multifamily, there are antennas on top of your building. If you live in single family, there are not antennas in your neighborhood. They are far away on a distant tower. And you know, that is the present, but it's not going to work in the future.
Yeah, I just think it's an area that we need to be sensitive towards and thinking about. And as we determine a path forward, I think that is at least part of the conversation that we ought to have, that there should be some level of equity here, you know, as we are taking this up as a core part of all the policy that we do. And again, to me, it's not just coverage, it's also standards.
All right. So we'll continue through here. Height. We have differences, you know, in what has been proposed or what is the current law and what other jurisdictions have done. So you can't raise the height of a pole much under the existing code. That's a problem. One of the real issues is that unfortunately poles are going to have to get taller in order to maintain separation of services on the pole. In other words, a 40-foot pole can't accommodate antennas which need a separation to the electricity line, which needs separation to the cable line, which needs separation to the other cable line. I mean, everybody has to have their room on the pole. And so what we're going to see, and this is everywhere, is as these wireless antennas come in, poles are going to have to often go up by 10 feet. I don't know what I think about that. You know, the poles on my own block were raised by 10 feet. I don't notice, you know, in a way it makes the wires farther away rather than closer. But you know, it is a reality. I think we need to be able to allow it. You know, if the companies are not allowed to install a pole that was taller than the one that was there before, then they can't do it. Like, you know, they can't displace the existing infrastructure. They have to be able to add to the infrastructure. So, you know, as far as the aesthetic issues here are concerned, you know, I have a very general comment I want to make, which is like, I don't love the way my router looks in my house. You know, I've got a pretty unsightly cable that stretches across the floor from the wall into my dining room where my router sits. But that's the only place it can go. And I'm totally dependent on the quality of connection that I have. As Craig Rice was saying, you know, we've got multiple people. My wife is teleworking. She's on Zoom all day. I'm on Zoom all day. My two kids are both MCPS students. They're on Zoom all day. And we all actually have multiple devices that are on, you know, fiber all day. So we have to have that antenna placed in the middle of the house so that everybody, wherever you are, you can get access to it. Does it look great? No. Do I still want it? Yes, absolutely. You know, that's the issue here. Like, if you want things to only look perfect, then you're just not going to be able to have a functional system. And, you know, hopefully one day some of that technology will get improved in its design, but there are some limitations, but the benefits vastly outweigh the costs. And there's no question we're not all better off, even if there is a little bit of, you know, equipment in our field of vision. We are all way better off with what that equipment does for us. Some people don't agree with that. Some people don't care. Some people don't care, frankly, if we have quality wireless networks. It's not a priority for them. I recognize that. However, that is not a point of view that can be Montgomery County's point of view. It's totally unacceptable, and it will. All right, so continuing here, that's going to be an issue. No real finality here. We're just talking about this, surfacing this. The height of the poles, the fact that they have to be replaced is relevant. Let's get to the next one. I think that kind of is important. Design standards. City of Tacoma Park commented on the design standards. They sent a letter.
Sorry, could I ask a question about
Yeah.
that?
Sure. Oh, let's go back to height.
Yes, sorry. So you raised earlier that we need to get as close to Arlington County, or your goal would be to get as close to Arlington County as possible.
Yeah.
I'm not, making a judgment call on that, but my understanding is that Arlington County, when it comes to height, is 6 feet higher than the original pole, but no higher than 35 feet. Is that accurate? Because, we
That's
also
what's in the
have
packet. Yeah, I see that.
a request from the industry saying that anything below 50 feet, which is what I believe Prince George's has, anything below 50 feet would be inadequate to the needs of deployment. So could someone just explain to me how it doesn't seem to jive? So I'm just trying to understand this issue. I recognize that this isn't an area that I have any background in whatsoever. I'm a total novice here, but
Sure.
those things don't seem to add up. And so if someone could explain that to me and how that all works, that would be helpful.
Let's try to do that. Let's look at so Prince George's is no higher than 50 feet. DC is no higher than 36 feet. Fairfax is 15 feet higher than the original, not higher than 50 feet higher than the original. Arlington is not higher than 6 feet higher than the original, or 35 feet.
So can I maybe offer something in this area?
Please, and if you know, or if someone knows what the FCC order says about height, I think that might be relevant.
So the FCC order 1 is they define small wireless facilities as things that are less than 50 feet in height.
Okay.
And there is a certain class of regulations which are basically getting at, are you making substantial modifications or not? So on one level, they define a certain class that's less than 50 feet. On the other level, they say that in the right of way where you're adding 10 feet to the structure, that doesn't count as, that is not substantial. So that's why you're seeing some of that language in there. The issue in some of these cases is that particularly in Arlington, where you have in a lot of areas that are more urbanized, just as like in Montgomery County, most of our taller street poles are about 27 feet tall. A little bit depends on how you count the cantilever of the arm coming out, but they're about 25, 27 feet tall. In neighborhoods where you have underground utilities and you have small, they look sort of like colonial light poles. They're usually of fiberglass. They have kind of a squarish top to them. Those are about 14 feet tall. So one thing is initially we had looked at putting in those difference in the increases, but in some ways in having gone through this a few times, there can be some benefit to actually setting a fixed height as to what the end result is. It's a lot easier to tell, well, how tall is it? In some cases, what we also found is that in the urban areas, the providers had a greater interest in placing the pole at the intersection rather than in the middle of the street. So literally where you have two streets come together, they would each rather have a pole on 3 of those 4 corners than to have something that's down the street in the middle. And that has to do with a little bit of the fact that these antennas are somewhat directional. If you think of them looking like a slice of pie rather than a circle, that's the way that you get coverage. And that's why you want to be potentially on a corner than in the middle of the street. But what we also found is that in some cases in urban areas, which the preference would be, is that if you replaced, we installed a lot of the short walk signs. And they were only like 4.5 feet tall, something like that. There would actually be a preference among some of the advisory groups to replace those crosswalk signs and put up a taller pole, which at that point, it could be sort of the same height as, or a little bit taller than anything kind of on the rest of the block, but it's taller than the thing that you're replacing. So in some ways, tagging it to a certain amount above the existing one becomes more problematic in the urban areas. In the residential areas, and you're going to talk about the design next, the fact of the matter is these things look less out of character in urban areas. They look much more out of character, and there's been some improvements in the design. But in a residential area, particularly where you don't have a lot of tree coverage, and you've got these very small 14-foot poles, and now I want to come in and put in something that's 35 feet. And depending on where it is, in previous iterations, we had language in there in which you were trying to get these things up with a preference. If you open my front door, it's not the one that's right in front of my front door. It might be the one that's between properties, a preference for that. Or alternatively, there's a preference if you drive in some of these neighborhoods, what you'll see the taller 25-foot pole on the slightly larger street. And then as you go into the subdivision, they'll have the shorter poles. So to the extent that you might be able to serve that by being on the wider street, that would be a preference as well. And I do think that once you talk about no longer attaching to utility poles, but replacement of streetlights, that is where the increase in size and the characteristic becomes most problematic. And that's been the toughest part to address.
Okay. So design standards are important as well. Okay. So
Can I just, I wouldn't say I understand everything that you just said, but I at least grasp the broader dynamic of what you are attempting to share. But you certainly have forgotten more since this morning about this issue than I will learn through this entire process. And I, respect that. So I will stand my ground here and just try to ask as best I can. I still don't quite understand. I get all the complicated, this is nuanced and complicated stuff, but everybody seems to be attacking this issue in a very different way. And some of the requirements that have been shared don't seem to be directly related to what the standards are,
Okay, so
like the idea that Arlington is the model that would be the deployment from the industry.
Let me see if I can take it from this direction. It is a policy choice which is bounded by some legal requirements. The legal requirement is that you have to permit an increase of 10 feet. The FCC has a different class of it mostly impacts how long you have to review the application. For those ones, it applies to anything that's less than 50 feet tall. So from a policy matter, you could say, all right, I want to cover as many things as possible. So I will say it applies to anything that's 50 feet or less. Or you could say, I want to take a more restrictive view in which I want to say it will apply to anything that's 10 feet taller than what exists.
Okay, so just so I'm understanding, the question is,
Okay, so
where we regulate it and make it conditional use, or the issue is what we're allowing?
Yeah,
or both.
So if you look at the way that and I'm glad that Livu mentioned the accessory dwelling and the waiver as a kind of in-between ground. So the idea of limited use is I lay out, these are the requirements. You come in and show I have met those requirements. You pass go, you go to permitting. You go to the tower committee, somebody's reviewed it engineering, you go to permitting. It's not a discretionary function. If you want to then parse out and say, okay, for things that are of this class, there it is. As these things maybe get deeper into neighborhoods, then maybe you say, okay, for this class, you have to come in and show that you couldn't have put it on something that was on a larger street. You want to come up with some types of objective criteria to avoid the problem of, I just don't want it in front of my house, right? These two poles are exactly the same. It's just simply one's in front of my house and one is not. And that puts the county in difficult position of, why do you justify one versus the other? There's no objective criteria. But if you have objective criteria that's tied to the width of the street, the height of the existing pole, height of surrounding poles, and by doing so, what you're also doing is you are driving the policy. So if I say that there are a class of poles that are limited use, and you have the ability to come in, and essentially it's non-discretionary. You've done your homework, you're going to meet the conditions, you're going to meet the requirements, you get to place your thing there. I will probably try to design my network, because all these things work together. So I'm going to design my network so that I can get to as many spots that I just get limited use, and I don't have to get a waiver, and I don't have to go to conditional use. And that's what the county executive and what Debbie was mentioning is that what you were trying to do is, can you design it in a way that where you already have taller poles or wider streets, that you've put in a preference by making it easier to get into those areas. And therefore, when you design a network, I try to do it so that like a honeycomb, my cells all work together, and I've maximized the most of them that will be in the least obtrusive places, which we would presume to be the wider streets and the taller existing poles.
So is there a proposal to do that? And then do we have an idea of?
Well, that's kind of what the existing ZTA seeks to do. I mean, the existing ZTA says by right, 60 feet or more, conditional use, 30 to 60, nothing closer than 30.
Within 30.
So it seeks to incentivize the furthest placement in order to, minimize neighborhood impact.
Yeah, in principle, yes. In practice, it's only tied to the height. It's not tied to the width of the pole. The width of the street, nor the surrounding height of the poles. And I don't recall whether it had a preference on the property line.
Well, it seems to me that what you're proposing, what's being proposed here, is the idea that if there are places that are more appropriate in the view of the county executive of deployment, but also would provide an added level of consistency, because you'd be able to go through limited use. If the county executive is proposing more limited use, but with certain standards, which is that it sounds to me like that is slightly different from the position that I had thought he had taken on the ZTA, but maybe I'm missing something a little bit here.
Well, it sounds also like maybe what a county executive who supported this, Mike Leggett, proposed. He had proposed that taller poles were limited use, so they could go ahead and use taller poles, but shorter poles were conditional. That got shot down at the county council because some council members said, oh, well, there's more shorter poles, in this community that I'm listening more to. And some people have said they don't support it. And so it didn't fly. But if we're talking about height rather than distance, I think we do need to look back at the FCC order and what it means for us with this 50 feet cutoff. And when I was referring to Arlington, I was referring to setbacks. It looks to me like Arlington also has to modify what it does in light of the FCC. But I didn't mean to imply that across the board, the Arlington approach is the preferred approach. Distance has generally been the biggest issue. Height has been a much more, that's just been a smaller issue, I guess.
Yeah, so it would be helpful to me. I mean, I wasn't around in the last council, and whatever proposal you're suggesting was rejected. I am still learning about this and trying to figure out how to address understandable concerns, but move forward. I mean, if there is specific suggestions of how to do what you're suggesting that we could incorporate into the, I don't think it's necessarily an either or in terms of what is in the ZTA, but it could just add additional layers to try to balance, certainty, which is important for deployment, and kind of understanding what the rules are before you go in, with not pitting residents against each other and putting the county in a very challenging dynamic and making seemingly subjective decisions by valuing certain places or properties over another, which is not an appropriate role county should be in, in this. I mean, our public policy goal should not be to pit residents against each other, should not be to make subjective choices among, certain types of properties and certain residents. I mean, I just don't think that's a position that the county would ever want to be in, nor should appropriately be in. So, if there's something more formal of what you're talking about for consideration, I would love to see it. And if you could distribute it to us, please, as the chair, I would appreciate
Yeah, definitely
being able to review that. Thank you.
We would welcome that. Just, to be clear, we have more work to do. We're after this session, we're going to be considering new, modifications, new ideas. We have to rethink everything in light of the FCC order. That's one reality. I think we also need to rethink maybe what is possible. I think this ZTA was crafted with a fairly pessimistic view about what council members would be willing to support. Maybe the council feels differently. Maybe people would actually like to support deployment, a little bit more firmly. Those are all questions I think we still haven't resolved. Okay, so continuing the design standards, I don't know how much there is to.
Hey, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Just very quickly, when it comes to relying upon zoning standards, and I certainly understand and respect what Mitzi was talking about, but I just have to say that we also have to be very cognizant of the fact that some of those zoning ordinances, some of those structures in terms of wider streets in some neighborhoods and narrower in others, were crafted in such a way with racial tinges as well. So again, I hate to keep harping on this, but we have to make sure that that's a part of our understanding when we're evaluating these things, and not just judging based on, well, this neighborhood has a narrower street, and not understand why it is that that neighborhood had a narrower street and was denied the same sorts of accoutrements that other richer neighborhoods were afforded. So again, and then that then leads to saying, well, you don't have a wider street, and so therefore we're not going to put broadband or 5G in your neighborhood. So again, we need to take those extra steps as a part of racial equity and social justice to make sure that we're exploring all of those aspects to make sure that we understand them before just making that blanket decision.
And can I just add there, I mean, I never thought I would know this much about street design in Montgomery County. I think that's an incredibly important point, that why some of these neighborhoods have streets that are designated as one thing versus another. When you actually drill down and go into some of these places, it's shocking in some places, like, oh, I wouldn't have thought that this fit into that category, which is what made it really difficult when we were looking at those objective criteria and standards. And that in some ways, if the end goal is to make sure that everybody has service, but at the same time that the residents' concerns are addressed, and then you have to layer in there the objective criteria, it's partly why maybe having some way that is a middle ground between conditional use and limited use can help address those situations where it doesn't fit a standard mold, but it meets some end objective.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say, I think Councilmember Rice's point is really important and well taken. How I was thinking about it, just to be clear, and I think this is to Councilmember Rice's point, it's harder, which it should be, but it's not among neighborhoods, it's within neighborhoods. So how I was hearing you speak about this earlier was about, if you have a neighborhood and there's a certain part of, like within that neighborhood, there are already existing taller structures in some area. And so you can have some level of nuance, but it shouldn't be one neighborhood gets one set of criteria and another neighborhood gets another set of criteria. I mean, to me, that is extremely problematic for all of the reasons that Councilmember Rice noted. And part of what I was suggesting in the beginning of, even within urban areas, commercial areas, and we consider to be residential areas, because the reality is every part of the county is a residential area. They're just different types of residences, and I think we need to be sensitive to that as well. But I think Councilmember Rice's points are really important.
Yeah, I mean, we have to look at why things are designated the way they are and not accept that the status quo, is the starting place. I think that's partly what he's saying as well, that we have to really understand the implications of what we're doing and strive to get the outcome that we want. All right, so design standards. So the ZTA does have design standards. Livu, maybe I could just ask you to kind of talk a little bit about this. We did get a letter from the city of Tacoma Park, and they didn't necessarily recommend specific design standards. There are design standards in this, and if they want to recommend additional design standards, we'd certainly welcome that. I don't want to imply that the gist of the city's letter was that design standards are the main issue. To me, it appeared that the letter really was saying we don't want 5G. I welcome getting clarification about what the design standards that they would favor might be, and provided that they don't, impede the deployment of the networks. Of course, we will make every effort to accommodate. Well, we can't do something different in Tacoma Park than we do elsewhere, but the point being, we welcome their thoughtful recommendations, and if they make sense for the county, we certainly want to do that. And the same goes for other municipalities. Very brief diversion. It's worth noting, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, I probably shouldn't even try to do this, but City of Gaithersburg is sometimes pointed to as a model for this. City of Gaithersburg basically says that the companies should negotiate with homeowners and put them on top of homes. And that's how they'll build out a network. I don't think that's a good approach. I don't think that's the one we want to pursue. I think we want to focus on putting antennas on utility poles and light poles, and not on private residences. So Livu, could you please talk a little bit about this segment of the ZTA?
Sure. So the design standards in the ZTA, there's basically 4 big ones. So first, that they have to be for the ones that are in the public right of way, and that includes both the footer and a replacement street light. All of that has to be approved by the Department of Transportation, which makes sense. And then the antenna has to be concealed in an enclosure that's the same color as the pole. And it also has to be installed parallel with the tower, so it's not jutting out at weird angles, basically. There is stuff about stealth design in there, but that also is stuff that has to be approved by the Department of Transportation. And then the tower has to be the same color as the pre-existing pole, so it doesn't stick out. And then there can't be any visible exterior wires, and that's unless the wire itself. So the wire itself could be enclosed in some sort of conduit, like a wooden thing or something that also just blends in with those utility poles. And so those are the design standards that are currently in the ZTA. Looking at the letter from the City of Tacoma Park, it didn't go into specific recommendations on design standards. It does reference, working with the individual cities and jurisdictions, but it didn't list specific suggestions for the design standards.
Okay. We'll invite them to send us design standards that they might request and take a look at that.
Oh, and I should note, sorry, that the volume, so there's also a certain width of the equipment, and I believe that's 12 cubic feet. I can confirm. Yeah, that's the maximum volume, I think, in the ZTA.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to a sort of meatier topic here, which is the conditional use process. We're joined by, there she is, Lynn Hannon. And we want to just hear about how conditional use matches up now with the FCC mandate. The FCC has been very clear about the accelerated time and cost that they think is reasonable. And, we really are obligated to meet that at this point. We sued them and we didn't win. So, we're living under the FCC's framework. So let's hear about what that means. I think maybe I'll just ask Livu if you can just, start explaining this a bit, and then we'll get some comments from Lynn and anybody who'd like to share on this one.
Sure, so I'll start with the FCC. So the FCC basically says for the small cell antennas, those are defined as the 50 feet. This goes back to the height discussion earlier. So those are just defined as ones that are 50 feet or less in height. So that's where that FCC shot clock kicks in, which is the 90-day approval process. And that's from the date the application is submitted. And so that's where reviewing our conditional use process comes in, because our current process, including the time goes the hearing examiner and planning and the Board of Appeals, all of that could not be done within that 90 days. So the only way we can do a conditional use at all is if somehow that whole process can get shortened or streamlined so that everything can move faster, so that we're not in violation of the FCC for all those small cell antennas, which are, again, the ones under 50 feet.
So I should note, this is where we began 5 years ago. The Board of Appeals and the hearing examiner came to the county council and said, we expect 700-800 applications in the coming years, and it is impossible for us to process these. And so a zoning text amendment was introduced by Councilmember Florine that made them limited use rather than conditional use. And that is when all hell broke loose. So we're still trying to put the demons back in the box. But in any event, now it has moved from being a administrative problem, which is what it was, I think, when you first brought it to us. There's no way to administer what we know is reality. We've got to change it to a requirement. The FCC has been very clear about what they will allow. So can you talk to us about, what's your reflections here on what we should be thinking about as we want to conform to our federal mandate?
Okay. We did shorten the process. We eliminated staff review, which is a minimum of 120 days. So planning staff does not review these.
You said, and you're talking, I don't mean to interrupt you, but you mean this is stuff that's happening now, presently, when you get an application, or?
No, this would be under this process.
Under this proposed, this is what is in the ZTA.
This is what is in the ZTA. We would not have planning staff, but we did preserve the ability to contact planning staff once in a while. There's an issue that nobody can agree on. And if they want to go out and look at a proposed location, they can. But under the application requirements, the applicants have to put in 3 simulations of the poles from three different views. So they have to have photo simulations of the proposed tower from 3 different views. And that enables us to make a determination about the visual impact without having a planning staff report or anything like that. So that was one thing we did. We also eliminated, we provided for an appeal directly to the circuit court. That's the bill is drafted now. And there is some question whether under state law, whether we can unilaterally eliminate that appeal process. Now we are working on this right now to look at ways legally that we can eliminate that or end the shot clock once the hearing examiner's decision is issued, and to allow the applicant to proceed even if there's an appeal. So that's one thing we're looking, but that's also one problem or one issue with the conditional use process. The other thing we did is allow batching of applications. OSA recommended a maximum of 5 applications because these can all, the portion we look at is a 300-foot, I think it's I can't remember if it's a radius or a diameter. But anyway, to consolidate all the zoning issues we'd have to look at, they all have to be the same for every application. So same master plan, same zoning, same type of community. You know, you don't want to have a tower in, you know, downtown Rockville in the same, you want similar types of structures. So we said, okay, 5 applications that have these similar basic facts. And that's the basis for a motion to consolidate. If you have enough similar facts, you can hear them all as one. So we did that, and we reduced the notice requirement. And the only people under the application that would be allowed a notice, it would be people within 300 feet of the property. And the reason for that is because these poles are smaller. They're not like our, you know, the conditional use 200-foot towers. There really isn't the same level of impact, broad impact. So we limited the notice and requirements to 300 feet. We also said that notice will be provided by a sign, and information about the application is on the sign, and then you can contact OSA and we will track if there are any postponements or anything like that, they will be tracked on OSA's website. So we don't have to continually send out notice if hearing dates are changed, or, you know, if there's a snowstorm or something like that, like in some cases we have to do. So those are a little bit, the findings needed for approval are also very limited. It's just which of 2 locations is the least visually intrusive, unless there's a height waiver, and then you can look at the need for the height waiver, the need for the height from a transmission aspect versus whether the compatibility of the pole. Again, you can't deny, I think Mitzi said, you can't deny these poles. So the only thing that we would really be doing is granting waivers or choosing alternative locations. Now, and that's one reason, I don't know if you want me to move on to the waiver and objection alternative.
Why don't you talk about that, please?
Okay, since the council adopted the accessory dwelling unit regulations, we have had experience with this objection procedure. And The objection procedure the notice would be provided the same way here with a sign at the location of the proposed pole. It doesn't require every new pole to go through a conditional use, there may be communities that are really happy with this and want the poles or don't object to the location. So it doesn't require every pole to have a public hearing, which would greatly reduce our process. The only time it would, one thing I didn't mention, I apologize, on the application process, the applicant has to propose 2 alternate locations for every pole. So people can see what the possibilities are and disagree based on those discrete possibilities. And just with those limited findings, under the waiver and objection process, the only time we would get that it would go to hearing is either if the company wanted a waiver of the height or a waiver of the height, or if there was an objection saying, no, that other location is really a better location. And because in my working with Mitzi back in 2019, the first applications, the companies just threw down, logistically where they thought they needed the coverage. And I have to say, we felt that the waiver and objection process, because the height of these is lower, we need more of them. We need a lot of them. And it would be of concern staffing wise, whether we could consolidate as many applications as would be needed to get these through in a reasonable time. So the waiver and objection theory, again, we've had objections to conditional uses, not very many, but it is a fast process. We hold a hearing within 30 days. We have 30 days to write a decision, and there's no issue about a mandatory appeal to the circuit court. To the Board of Appeals. You can go right to circuit court. So that's kind of a nutshell of where we are in re-looking at this in 2021.
Okay. It's intriguing. I think we can develop that a little further. We'll follow up and get that written down. Consider how it could be applied.
We're not making policy. We're just working through some things. There are some interpretations that have changed since we originally did this. So we're trying to work through them.
Well, let me just pause for a second to recognize Ehsan Motazedi, who is, I think, Deputy Director at DPS and has been really a pleasure to work with for many years on a lot of very challenging issues. And Linda Kobilski. Hey, all right. Welcome. I don't know if we've seen you here yet at PHED in the past bit, but glad you're here. Would you like to share any comments from DPS's perspective?
Well, thank you for having me. This is actually my first appearance in one of your virtual sessions. So it is unique. No, the only thing I can add to this is that the commercial portion of the 1802 that passed, I guess, 3 years ago, I've heard today, DPS has, in my humble opinion, we've done a very good job of making sure not only are those applications being processed in a timely way, but also making sure that we're capturing information for this panel, for folks who are ultimately going to be interested in what we are approving, what the Tower Committee has approved. And we are still working on getting some of that information available in a very easy way for the public. So there is a data set right now that's out there through Data Montgomery, but it's not as robust as it should be. And we're still working on that piece of it so that the public can rest assured that whatever the Tower Committee has approved DPS through our permitting process and inspections, we are making sure that that is what's on that pole or on that building, if you will. So
That's very important. A lot of the concerns that I heard early on were about access to information and transparency. People felt like not only was there the possibility of new installation, but they couldn't find out information about that installation. And then, of course, anxieties become a lot more intense. So I'm glad to hear you're working through that, and I think it'll help a lot. I think it'll help a lot.
So thank you. I mean, thank you, Councilman Reamer, and Fritzson, and I think Craig Rice. I don't know if he's still over here or not. So yeah, as Linda alluded, one of the biggest issue was that you could not find the pole. One of the issue was because of the address, and they try to provide an address as close as it is in the proximity. What we have developed, like Linda is saying, and even to get a GPS coordinate, that we know exactly where the location of that proposed utility pole or the relocation is. So from that standpoint, and we have developed an extensive detailed page. So whatever comes from the Tower Committee, all the recommendation plus utility pole number, anything that we can do. And then as far as there were complaints or they were concerned with some of these pole, are they, you do another pole, are they removed? Are they, because they would not relocate them as part of the 1802. So yeah, we've done a lot of stuff. So again, and with this CTA, for us, there are stuff that goes back and forth, but once it becomes the law, we have to do what we have to do at DPS. So from that standpoint, so that's all I have to say, and really no comment. Some of this stuff we have discussed in the past, but if you have any question for myself, Linda, be more than happy to provide the feedback.
Okay. Thank you. Glad you're here. All right, so we have some follow-up work. We're more conversation. Maybe we'll come up with some new options or refined options on conditional use and the waiver process. We are looking at distance and height. So why don't we continue on to other issues on page 9. We've got RF testing. I don't know. So I guess the Tacoma Park, they're allowed to require more testing if they're just allowed to do that. Okay, so that's their business, I think, right? Then
Councilmember Reamer,
yeah.
I don't know if this is the proper time. We're looking at potentially also doing post-installation testing, which is particularly important for areas where there are multiple antennas, which is, I think, where there've been a lot of questions and concerns.
Okay.
But we're still trying to work through the process and how that's handled. But we've been told it's pretty common in many jurisdictions.
Okay. All right. Well, look to hear from you there. Fees. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about fees, but to restate it, our system and the fees that it's charged, that we charge to use our system, are built for the use of very few poles that are very tall that have a big impact. A 400-foot pole, the kind of pole you see on the side of the highway or on a really large road. That's basically what our whole administrative structure is geared towards, and it's what the fees that we charge is geared towards. So now we have a new environment, and the FCC has limited the fees that you can charge to reading from the packet here, actual costs or $500. Livu, can you give us a little update on this? And then we'll talk about the consequences.
So and some of this was affected by that Ninth Circuit decision as well. So basically the charge for the use of that right of way is capping it at $500 for the application fees. And then there was also a no more than $270 for any recurring fees for each wireless facility. So those were two of the things that came out of the Ninth Circuit court decision. I will admit I don't have in front of me what the actual costs are. I suspect they're more than $500, and probably the hearing examiner can
The actual
confirm that.
cost, yeah, the actual costs depend on how much time you spend working on them.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And if you want to allow them to be put on poles, then it doesn't cost much money to, have that kind of system. So we have a very expensive system that is designed for a lot of scrutiny over very few installations. And, this is a fundamental issue. We have to rewrite that all. So we'll need separate legislation, which we have been working on as far as those fees are concerned, because they don't get set in the zoning code. Anything you want to share from the executive branch side? I know you're.
They actually are. Oh, I take that back. They are set right now in the county code, but they are also reiterated in the regulations. And one of the things, the recommendation maybe is don't put them in the code. If you have them in the regulations, as you do, you review your fees on every couple of years, it makes it easier to just simply either come back and give council notice or have you have a chance to weigh in on it, and keep them up to date.
Okay.
If I may, I think Mitzi's talking about the right-of-way fees. The conditional use fees, as Mr. Reamer said, are set in a resolution periodically adopted by the county council. So they're not codified.
So there's 4 types of potential fees. There is a franchise fee, which is for these telecom uses. It's not stated where it's these. If the cable franchise fees are set in the code, I don't believe that the telecom fees are set there, and they tend to be in the franchise agreements themselves. There is a tower committee, TFCG, Transmission Facilities Coordinating Group, which is the engineering fee. That is the one that is currently in the county code under Executive Branch Technology Services, TFCG. And it is also reiterated in the regulations for that. The permitting fees are set by the permitting department. And I don't believe those are in code. I think those are in their regulations. And it's been a few years now, but I'm going to say now 5 years ago, they actually had done a study and reviewed their fees and actually removed the additional fee for permitting going to electronic filing because they didn't need it. So that's in good shape. And then the last thing that Lynn is mentioning is that in the event that you go not limited use, but conditional use and need to go to OZA, then there is a resolution as to what OZA can collect.
And to be
It's
clear,
adopted by the council. The fees are set by the council by resolution.
and to be clear, the fees that are contemplated for the tower committee, and I believe also for DPS, Asan could confirm, are to cover the costs of processing. It's not to make a profit, and they're just supposed to cover the staff costs.
Absolutely.
Yes,
And
it's actually a function of state law. The county cannot claim that something is a fee when it's not intended to just simply cover costs.
Otherwise, it's a tax.
Yeah, so it's just been this whole FCC thing about it, and our position has always been is we already have to do that. And we're already in compliance with it.
And we are enterprise fund, so for us, it is the cost for us to do the business is the time of the fee are based on the time we spend on each plan and each permit.
And OZA's fees in general are well under, our budget is 650,000 and we collect 90,000 in fees. So our fees are well under our operating costs. Was that a bad thing to say?
Circle of trust. Okay. All right. I think we've covered pretty much everything. We can stop for here. Stop for now. So a little more work. We have another session scheduled already, Libu or Pam?
It has not been scheduled yet. I believe the suggestion was to have economic development involved in that one in the tech council. So I don't think a date has been set for that yet, but I can work on that.
Okay, why don't we circle back? Maybe ideally we can get another session set for like 3 weeks from now, giving us time to craft additional changes and see, how council members feel about them.
So, sorry, so economic development and tech council are involved in the next one. So that's not going to be we're not going to be voting at that either.
Well,
informational.
The original plan was for a subsequent session to include a discussion about economic development. I'm not 100% sure we need to do that. So I think we can talk about that a bit more. We have 2 options. We can come back for another session with amendments and votes and just make it very, a work session, or we can have a workhorse or a show horse. We can come back and we can talk about the impact and the importance and the value. I'm not sure yet. I will, my office will talk to your office and we'll figure out what seems best.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, we got through it. I have had better trips to the dentist, but it was okay. Thank you very much. And we will see you soon. And I hope we can get this thing done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Appreciate it.